"Order in this court." The judge's voice didn't finish, because something unseen shifted the room before the sound ever could. A silence that landed heavier than any noise. The kind that made people stop mid-breath and glance at each other without knowing why. And in the center of it stood Naomi Reed, her posture straight, her hands at her sides, her expression unreadable under the cold white lights that reflected off the polished wood and glass like a mirror no one wanted to look into. While Officer Ethan Cole stood just a few feet away, his presence rigid, controlled, the kind of control that came from years of being listened to without question, the kind that assumed the room would always bend in his direction, and for a moment, it still did, because no one spoke, no one moved. Not even the court reporter whose fingers hovered above the keys as if waiting for permission to exist again. And Naomi didn't react the way people expected. She didn't raise her voice or step back or demand anything. She simply breathed in slowly, as if grounding herself in something deeper than the moment, something older than the walls around her. And when she finally lifted her eyes, she didn't look angry. She looked certain, which unsettled people more than anger ever could. Because certainty didn't ask for approval, it didn't negotiate, it just was. And somewhere in the back row, a man shifted in his seat, clearing his throat before thinking better of it, while a woman near the aisle tightened her grip on her purse like she'd just remembered something important, but couldn't quite place it. And Ethan noticed it too, not consciously at first, just a flicker in the corner of his awareness, the way the air no longer felt entirely his, the way the silence wasn't supporting him anymore, but pressing against him instead, and he adjusted his stance slightly, subtle enough that no one could call it discomfort, but enough that he felt it. And Naomi's voice came next, not loud, not forceful, just steady, cutting clean through the stillness without disturbing it. "You just made a mistake," she said, and the words didn't echo. They settled, like dust finding its place after something had been moved, and a few heads turned, not toward Ethan, but toward her, because there was something in the way she said it that didn't match the role she'd been placed in, something that didn't fit the narrative everyone had already decided on before she even walked in. And the judge leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting against the bench as if he were about to speak, then paused, studying her in a way that suggested he was recalibrating, reassessing, as if the script had shifted without warning. And Ethan let out a short breath through his nose, a quiet dismissal. But it lacked its usual edge, because now there was a question beneath it, small, almost invisible. But there, and Naomi didn't move, didn't step forward or back. She simply stood in the space she occupied like it belonged to her, like she wasn't asking for permission to be there. And that was when the room truly changed, not in sound, but in weight. In the subtle way attention redistributed itself, the way eyes lingered a second longer, the way people stopped assuming and started observing. And somewhere near the front, a young intern glanced down at the case file in his lap, flipping a page as if searching for something he'd missed, while Naomi's gaze remained fixed, not aggressive, not defensive, just unwavering. And for the first time since he entered the room, Ethan felt the need to explain something he hadn't yet been asked about, a reflex he didn't recognize as such, and it irritated him. Sharpened the edges of his posture again, but not enough to restore what had been lost, because control, once cracked, didn't seal back the same way. And Naomi spoke again, quieter this time, almost conversational, but somehow clearer. "You assumed I wouldn't respond," she said, and a faint murmur rippled through the room before being swallowed by the same silence that had settled earlier. Only now it felt different, less like absence and more like anticipation, like something waiting to unfold. And the judge finally lifted his gavel, not to strike it, but to hold it, suspended, as if even he wasn't ready to interrupt what was happening. And Naomi's breathing remained steady, her shoulders relaxed, her presence grounded in a way that made the fluorescent lights above seem less harsh, less cold, as if they too were being forced to reveal something instead of conceal it. And Ethan shifted his weight again, this time more noticeable, his jaw tightening just slightly, not from anger, but from something closer to uncertainty, the kind that crept in quietly and refused to leave. And Naomi saw it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with recognition, as if she'd seen this moment before in a different room, with different faces, and knew exactly where it led. And she didn't rush it. didn't push. She simply let the silence do its work, let the room feel what it needed to feel, until the balance tilted just enough that nothing could go back to the way it was before. The silence did not break. It stretched, thin and tight like a wire pulled too far, and then a chair creaked somewhere near the back, a small sound that should not have mattered but did, because it reminded everyone that they were still there, still watching, still part of something that was no longer moving in a straight line, and Ethan Cole felt it settle under his skin, that shift he could not name but could not ignore. So he straightened his shoulders again, drawing in a breath as if resetting the room by force of will, his voice coming out measured, controlled, the tone of someone used to restoring order without resistance. "You are out of line," he said, not loud, but firm enough to travel, and for a second it almost worked, because a few heads nodded automatically, reflexively aligning with the authority they recognized. But Naomi did not move, did not flinch, and that lack of reaction made the words feel like they had landed somewhere short of their target, like a door that did not open because it was never unlocked to begin with. And the judge's gavel lowered an inch, still hovering, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the exchange unfold without interrupting, which was unusual, because interruption was his role, control was his function, and yet something in Naomi's stillness seemed to suggest that stepping in too soon would miss something important. And across the aisle, a public defender shuffled through papers, his fingers moving faster now, scanning lines he had already read, as if trying to catch up to a moment that had moved ahead of him, while Naomi finally shifted, just enough to turn her head toward the bench, not away from Ethan, but not fixed on him either, her attention expanding rather than retreating, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm weight. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said, and the phrasing hung in the air. Differently, not defensive, not argumentative, but declarative, like a statement that did not require validation, and a faint murmur rose again, quickly suppressed, but not before it rippled through the rows of observers, because people were beginning to notice that this was not escalating in the way they expected. There was no shouting, no chaos, no loss of composure, just a steady unraveling of assumptions that made the room feel smaller, tighter, more focused, and Ethan's jaw tightened a fraction more, his eyes flicking briefly toward the judge, then back to Naomi, calculating, adjusting, trying to find the angle that would bring things back into alignment. But every time he looked at her, there was that same stillness, that same quiet certainty that did not give him anything to push against, and it unsettled him in a way he had not felt in years, not since early in his career when experience had not yet filled in all the blanks. And for a moment, just a moment, that younger uncertainty brushed against him again before he forced it down, replacing it with something sharper, more familiar. "You think you understand this situation," he said, his tone edging towards something colder, more pointed, "but you do not." And the words were meant to close the gap, to reassert the hierarchy that everyone in the room had walked in expecting. But Naomi's response came without hesitation, not louder, not stronger, just clearer. "I understand exactly what is happening," she said. And this time, she took a small step forward, not toward him in challenge, but into the space itself, as if claiming her place within it. And that single movement drew every eye, because it was the first visible action she had taken, and it was so deliberate, so controlled, that it carried more weight than any raised voice could have. And the judge finally lowered the gavel fully, not striking it, just resting it against the bench, his expression shifting from observation to something closer to engagement, while a clerk near the side table adjusted her glasses, leaning in slightly, her pen hovering above her notes, ready now, because something told her this was the moment to start writing again. And Naomi's gaze returned to Ethan, steady as before, but now there was something else in it, not defiance, not anger, but recognition, as if she had seen this exact posture, this exact tone, this exact attempt to reframe reality before, and knew exactly how it ended. And when she spoke again, her voice dropped just enough to pull the room closer. "You assumed I would stay silent," she said. "You assumed I would not know my rights. You assumed no one would question you." And each phrase landed with the same measured cadence, not rushed, not emphasized, just placed, one after the other, like markers outlining a path that had already been walked, and Ethan felt the edges of that path closing in, not physically, but conceptually, as if the version of events he had relied on was being quietly dismantled piece by piece. And somewhere in the second row, a man who had been leaning back crossed his arms, sitting forward now, his attention fully engaged, because the story he thought he was watching was no longer the one being told, and the room, once divided by roles and expectations, began to feel unified by something else entirely, a shared awareness that something real was unfolding in front of them, something that did not need volume to command attention. And Naomi let the silence settle again after her words, not filling it, not rushing past it, just allowing it to exist, because she knew, instinctively or by experience, that this was where the shift happened, not in noise, but in stillness, not in force, but in clarity. And Ethan, for the first time since he stepped into the room, did not immediately respond. The pause lingered longer than anyone expected, stretching into a space where even the smallest movement felt amplified, and Ethan Cole finally shifted his gaze, not away from Naomi, but past her for a fraction of a second, as if recalibrating his position within a room that no longer aligned with him the way it had just minutes ago. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but measured in a way that suggested calculation rather than certainty. "You are making assumptions," he said, each word placed carefully, like he was choosing a path he could still control. And Naomi's eyes did not leave him, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture now, something almost imperceptible, like a line drawn more clearly in the sand, and she responded without hesitation. "No," she said, "I am correcting yours." And that distinction landed differently, because it reframed everything that had been happening, not as conflict, but as clarification. And the judge leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled now, studying her with a focus that had moved beyond curiosity into something sharper, something evaluative. While the clerk's pen finally touched paper, the faint scratching sound marking the first written acknowledgement that this moment mattered. And across the aisle, the public defender stopped flipping pages entirely, his attention fully captured, his earlier urgency replaced by stillness, because he realized, perhaps too late, that Naomi was not relying on him. She was operating independently, and that realization carried both surprise and something close to unease, because it disrupted the roles everyone had unconsciously accepted. And Naomi took another breath, steady, controlled, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, not louder, but more precise. "You entered this room believing you defined the narrative," she said, and a faint tension moved through the spectators, because the word narrative shifted the frame from event to interpretation, from what happened to how it was understood. And Ethan's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not just resistance, it was recognition that the ground beneath him was no longer stable, and he stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, but adjusting, creating space that had not been there before. And Naomi continued, "But the record is not written by assumptions," she said, her gaze briefly flicking toward the clerk, then back to him. "It is written by facts." And the clerk's pen paused for a split second before continuing, as if even that simple acknowledgement carried weight. And a man in the back row leaned forward further, elbows on his knees, fully engaged now, because the tension in the room was no longer about confrontation, it was about revelation, about watching something unfold that could not be undone once seen. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his composure still intact, but thinner now, stretched across a reality that was shifting in real time. "You are not in a position to determine that," he said, his tone still controlled, but lacking the earlier certainty that had made it effortless. And Naomi's response came just as calmly. "I am in a position to state what is true," she said, and the difference between determine and state did not go unnoticed. It separated authority from truth, control from reality, and the judge's expression shifted again, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were tracing that distinction, weighing it. And for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold that line between them, that invisible boundary where power met clarity, and something began to tip, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like a scale finding its balance after being weighted too heavily on one side. And Naomi took one more small step, not aggressive, not confrontational, just forward enough to anchor herself more firmly within the space. And when she spoke again, her voice lowered slightly, drawing the room closer without raising the volume. "You relied on silence," she said, "because silence protects assumptions." And a faint ripple moved through the observers again, because the statement reached beyond the moment, touching something broader, something many of them recognized but rarely named. And Ethan's eyes flickered, just for a second, a brief crack in the surface that revealed something underneath, something less certain, and he shifted his weight again, this time more noticeably, his stance no longer as grounded as before, and Naomi saw it, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, and she continued, "But silence also reveals what people are unwilling to say," she added, and the room responded to that, not with sound, but with attention, a collective leaning in, a shared recognition that this was no longer about a single exchange. It was about something deeper, something structural, something that extended beyond the walls of the courtroom. And the judge finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Reed," he said, and every head turned slightly toward him, because his intervention marked a shift, an acknowledgement that the moment had reached a threshold that required formal recognition. And Naomi turned her gaze to him without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her composure intact, and for a brief second, there was a quiet understanding between them, not agreement, not alignment, but recognition, as if both understood that what came next would define more than just the outcome of the case. It would define how the moment itself was recorded, and the gavel in his hand remained still, resting against the bench, as if even he understood that striking it too soon might interrupt something that needed to be fully seen before it could be judged. The judge's voice did not rise, but it carried, firm enough to settle the edges of the room without breaking the tension that had already taken hold. "Miss Reed," he repeated, slower this time, as if measuring not just her response but the weight of the moment itself. And Naomi inclined her head slightly, not submissive, not defiant, simply acknowledging the address, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, while the overhead lights hummed faintly, a low mechanical presence that seemed louder now in the quiet. And for a second, the courtroom felt smaller, contained within the space between two people who understood that something irreversible had begun, and the judge's gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan Cole, then back to Naomi. "You will confine your statements to matters relevant to this proceeding," he said, and the words were procedural, expected, but there was a subtle pause before he finished, a hesitation that suggested he was aware that relevance itself was no longer a simple concept in this room. And Naomi responded without delay, her voice calm, grounded. "Everything I have said is relevant," she replied, and the clarity of that statement did not challenge the judge. It aligned with something deeper, something he could not dismiss outright without examining it further. And a faint shift moved through the gallery, the sound of someone adjusting in their seat, another person exhaling softly, because the exchange had not restored order, it had redefined it. And Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, his mind working through the shifting dynamics, trying to identify the point where control had slipped, where the narrative had moved beyond his reach. And he took a step closer to the center, his shoes making a soft, deliberate sound against the polished floor, a reminder of his presence, his role, his authority. But even that sound did not carry the same weight it had earlier, because the room was no longer responding to position alone. It was responding to something else, something less visible but more powerful. And Naomi turned her attention fully to the bench now, her shoulders squared, her stance anchored, and when she spoke again, her words were slower, more deliberate, as if she were laying out a path that could be followed. "Your Honor, I am asking that the record reflect what has occurred in this room," she said. And the phrasing was precise, legal, unmistakably intentional. And the clerk's pen paused again, hovering, waiting for confirmation before committing anything to paper, because this was the moment where observation became record, where experience became fact. And the judge's expression tightened just slightly, not in resistance, but in awareness, because he understood the implication of what she was asking. And he glanced once more at Ethan, whose posture had shifted again, subtle but undeniable, his shoulders no longer as relaxed, his stance no longer as certain, and for the first time, There was a flicker of something in his eyes that did not align with control, something closer to calculation under pressure, and Naomi continued, her voice unwavering. I am asking that it be noted that assumptions were made before facts were established, she said, and the words landed with a quiet force that did not need volume to be felt, and the room responded not with noise, but with attention, a collective stillness that indicated everyone understood the significance of what was being said. And a man near the aisle glanced at the person beside him, then back to the front, as if confirming that he was not the only one seeing this unfold, while the public defender, who had remained silent until now, slowly closed the file in his hands, not because he was disengaging, but because he realized the case was no longer confined to the pages in front of him. It was happening in real time, in a way that no document could fully capture, and the judge exhaled quietly, the sound almost imperceptible, but present, a sign that he was weighing more than just procedure. He was weighing responsibility, and when he spoke again, his tone remained steady, but there was a shift beneath it, something more deliberate. Proceed, he said, and the single word carried permission, not just to speak, but to continue unfolding what had already begun. And Naomi nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and turned her gaze back toward Ethan, not confrontational, not accusatory, but direct, and in that moment, the space between them felt different, no longer defined by hierarchy, but by clarity, and she took a breath, not to steady herself, but to mark the transition into something deeper, something that could not be undone once spoken. And when she began again, her voice carried the same calm certainty, but now there was an added precision, a focus that suggested she was no longer responding to the moment, she was guiding it. Officer Cole, she said, addressing him directly for the first time in a way that acknowledged his role without yielding to it. You acted before verifying. And the statement was simple, but it carried layers, implications that extended beyond the immediate exchange, and Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, his expression controlled, but the tension in his jaw visible now, a sign that the balance had shifted in a way he could not easily correct. And Naomi did not press, did not escalate. She allowed the words to settle, to be felt, to exist within the room without being rushed past, because she understood that the power of the moment was not in how quickly it moved, but in how clearly it was seen. And around them, the courtroom remained silent, not because it had been commanded to be, but because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding. Not now. Not when it had become something more than just a case. Something that was revealing itself piece by piece, in the space between words, in the stillness that followed them, in the quiet recognition that what had been assumed could no longer remain unexamined. The words did not rush forward, they settled first, as if the room itself needed a moment to absorb what had just been placed into it. And Ethan Cole held Naomi's gaze longer this time, not out of dominance, but because looking away would have meant conceding something he was not yet ready to name. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a careful restraint, the kind that came from realizing that every word now would be measured against something sharper than authority. I acted based on the information available to me, he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, structured, a return to protocol, to training, to the framework that had always protected him before. And a few heads in the room nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of the language, because it sounded familiar, it sounded official, it sounded safe, and for a brief moment, it almost restored a sense of order. But Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the sentence to exist fully, to settle into the space between them, and then she tilted her head just slightly, a small gesture that carried more weight than it should have, because it suggested she was not dismissing his statement, she was examining it. And when she spoke, her tone remained even, almost reflective. Available to you, she repeated, and the subtle emphasis reframed the phrase, shifting it from justification to limitation. And the distinction did not go unnoticed. Not by the judge, whose fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the bench, and not by the clerk, whose pen paused mid-word, hovering again as if waiting to see which version of the truth would take shape. And Ethan's posture stiffened, not visibly enough to call out, but enough that those closest to him could sense it. And he responded, this time a fraction quicker. That is correct, he said, and the certainty in his voice was still there. but thinner now, like a surface stretched over. Something less stable, and Naomi took another breath, steady, controlled, and stepped slightly to her left, not to create distance, but to shift the angle, to change the way the room saw them. And that movement drew attention again, because it was intentional, because nothing she had done so far had been accidental. And when she continued, her voice carried that same quiet precision. And what was available to you did not include verification, she said, and the word verification landed differently, because it introduced a standard, a process, something measurable, something that could be examined beyond opinion. And a man in the back row leaned further forward, his elbows now resting on his knees, his attention fully locked, while a woman near the front pressed her lips together, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if connecting pieces that had not been clear before. And Ethan's gaze flickered again, just for a second, toward the judge, then back to Naomi, and that brief glance did not go unnoticed, because it suggested awareness. It suggested that he understood the direction this was moving, even if he had not yet found a way to redirect it. And he exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. The situation required immediate response, he said, and the words were firm, grounded in urgency, in necessity, the language of action rather than reflection. And for a moment, it held, because urgency had its own logic, its own weight, its own ability to justify decisions made without pause. But Naomi did not challenge the urgency. She acknowledged it with a slight nod, a small, almost imperceptible movement that shifted the tone again, because she was not dismissing his reasoning. She was incorporating it, and that made her next words land even more precisely. Immediate response does not eliminate responsibility, she said, and the sentence was simple, direct, but it carried a depth that reached beyond the moment, touching something broader, something structural, something that could not be easily argued without unraveling itself. And the room reacted not with sound, but with stillness, a deeper stillness than before, because now the conversation had moved into a space where neither side could rely on surface arguments. And the judge leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpened, his expression no longer neutral, but engaged in a way that suggested he was tracking every word, every shift, every implication. And the clerk resumed writing, the faint scratching sound steady now, consistent, as if the record itself had found its rhythm. And Ethan's jaw tightened again, more visibly this time, his composure still present, but under strain. And he took a step back, not retreating, but creating space, as if distance might restore clarity. And Naomi watched him, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with the same steady recognition, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to do, and why it would not work. And when she spoke again, her voice softened slightly, not weaker, but more focused, drawing the room closer without raising the volume. You made a decision, she said, before confirming the facts. And the phrasing was careful, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. And that made it harder to deflect, harder to dismiss, because it did not rely on interpretation, it relied on sequence, on order, on what came first and what should have come after. And a quiet shift moved through the spectators again, the kind that came when people recognized a pattern, when they saw something laid out clearly enough that it could not be unseen. And Ethan opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, then paused, just for a fraction of a second. And in that pause, something changed, something subtle but significant, because it was the first time he had hesitated, not from lack of words, but from awareness of their impact. And Naomi did not fill the silence. She let it remain. She let it expand, because she knew that this was where the real shift happened, not in what was said, but in what could no longer be said the same way again. And around them, the courtroom remained completely still, not out of obligation, but because no one wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, not now, not when the truth was beginning to take shape in a way that could not be reversed. The hesitation did not pass unnoticed. It settled into the room like a quiet signal that something fundamental had shifted, and Ethan Cole felt it more than he saw it. The way the air seemed to press differently against him. The way the silence no longer supported his words, but waited for something more. And he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, recalibrating, his voice returning with a controlled firmness that suggested he was not finished. Decisions are made under pressure, he said. And this time there was a slight edge beneath the calm, not anger, but insistence, as if he were reminding the room of a reality that could not be ignored. And a few heads moved again, subtle acknowledgments of that truth, because pressure was real, urgency was real, and for a moment it felt like the balance might tilt back. But Naomi did not interrupt. She allowed the statement to stand fully, to be heard, to be recognized. And then she nodded once, a small, measured gesture that shifted the tone again, because she was not opposing him. She was aligning with part of what he said, and that made her next words land with even greater clarity. Yes, she said quietly. They are. And the agreement was unexpected. It softened the edges of the exchange without weakening her position, and the judge's eyes narrowed slightly, tracking the shift, while the clerk's pen continued moving, steady now, capturing each turn with quiet precision. And Naomi took a breath, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that made the room feel anchored around her. And she continued, "But pressure does not change the order of responsibility," she said, and the phrasing carried a quiet authority, not imposed, but inherent, as if it had been tested long before this moment. And a subtle ripple moved through the gallery again. Because the distinction was clear, pressure explained action, but it did not excuse it, and that separation mattered. It reframed everything that had come before, and Ethan felt it. The narrowing of options, the way each response now had to pass through a tighter space, a more defined lens, and he shifted his stance again, his weight redistributing, as if searching for footing that no longer shifted beneath him. "You are speaking in generalities," he said, and there was a slight push in the words now, a deliberate attempt to redirect, to move the conversation away from specifics, back into something broader, less binding. But Naomi's response came without hesitation, her voice calm, precise. "No," she said, "I'm speaking about sequence." And the single word carried weight, because sequence was not abstract. It was measurable, it was traceable, it could be examined step by step. And the judge leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening again, while the public defender, who had remained still for several minutes, finally shifted in his seat, his expression changing from uncertainty to something closer to realization, as if he were seeing the structure of the argument take form in a way he had not anticipated. And Naomi took a small step forward again, not closing distance, but reinforcing presence. And when she continued, her voice lowered just enough to draw the room closer. "What happened first matters," she said, and the simplicity of the statement made it impossible to dismiss, because it did not rely on interpretation, it relied on order, and order could be verified, could be confirmed, could be recorded. And the clerk's pen moved faster now, the faint scratching sound steady, consistent, as if the record itself had found its direction. And Ethan's gaze flickered once more, this time not toward the judge, but toward the floor for a fraction of a second, a brief break in eye contact that did not go unnoticed, because it marked a shift, small but significant. And when he looked back up, his expression remained controlled, but the certainty beneath it had thinned. "Further, the situation required immediate control," he said, and the word control carried weight. It was the language of authority, of maintaining order, of preventing escalation. And for a moment it seemed to restore a sense of structure. But Naomi did not challenge the need for control. She acknowledged it with another slight nod, and that acknowledgement again shifted the dynamic, because she was not rejecting his premise. She was refining it, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same steady clarity. "Control without confirmation creates risk," she said, and the sentence landed with quiet force, because it did not accuse, it defined. It outlined a principle that extended beyond the moment, and the room responded with stillness again, deeper now, more focused, because the argument had moved into a space where each word built on the last, where each statement narrowed the path forward. And the judge's fingers tapped lightly against the bench, once, twice, a subtle rhythm that suggested he was processing not just the content, but the structure of what was being presented. And Naomi continued, her gaze steady on Ethan. "And risk affects everyone in this room," she added, and that inclusion widened the scope. It brought the observers into the equation. It reminded them that this was not isolated, that the implications extended beyond the two people standing at the center. and a man in the back shifted again, his posture tightening slightly, while a woman near the front exhaled softly, her attention unwavering, and Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused again, the hesitation more visible this time. And in that pause, the room seemed to lean in further, not physically, but collectively, as if everyone present understood that something had reached a point where it could not be easily redirected. And Naomi did not fill the silence. She allowed it to expand, to settle, to do its work, because she understood that the most powerful shifts did not happen in noise. They happened in stillness, in the space where truth had room to be seen clearly, without interruption, without distortion. And as the seconds passed, the balance in the room continued to tilt, not abruptly, but steadily, moving away from assumption and towards something far more difficult to ignore. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, like something invisible had taken shape between them, and Ethan Cole could feel it tightening, narrowing the space where his words could move freely, and he adjusted his stance again, this time slower, more deliberate, as if each movement needed to be justified even to himself. And when he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but there was a trace of something underneath now, something less certain. "You are interpreting my actions after the fact," he said, and the phrasing carried an attempt to reframe, to pull the moment back into a familiar pattern where timing could excuse clarity, where hindsight could be dismissed as advantage. And a few people in the room shifted slightly, recognizing the strategy even if they could not name it. And Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, and when she responded, her voice remained calm, but there was a subtle firmness now, a quiet tightening of focus that made the words land more precisely. "I am describing them in order," she said, and the distinction was small, but it held weight, because description did not rely on advantage, it relied on accuracy. And the judge's eyes flicked briefly toward the clerk, then back to Naomi, as if confirming that the record was capturing not just the words, but the structure behind them. And the clerk's pen continued moving, steady, consistent, no longer pausing, as if the uncertainty about what mattered had been resolved. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled rhythm, but the tension in his jaw remained, more visible now. And he took a step to the side again, not retreating, but repositioning, as if a different angle might restore perspective. "You are ignoring the context," he said, and the word context carried weight. It suggested complexity, nuance, variables that could not be reduced to sequence alone, and for a moment, it seemed to expand the space again, to introduce doubt. But Naomi nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, without conceding it, and that acknowledgement shifted the tone once more, because she was not dismissing context, she was integrating it. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same measured clarity. "Context explains why something happened," she said. "It does not change what happened." And the sentence landed with quiet force, because it separated explanation from alteration, reason from reality. And the room responded with a deeper stillness, the kind that came when something fundamental had been stated plainly enough that it could not be easily argued without unraveling itself. And a man near the back leaned forward even more, his hands clasped now, his attention fully absorbed, while the woman near the aisle who had been holding her purse loosened her grip slightly, her posture softening as if something had settled into place for her. And Ethan's gaze flickered again, this time lingering for a fraction of a second longer than before. And when he looked back at Naomi, there was a shift there, subtle but undeniable, not surrender, not agreement, but awareness, the recognition that the path he had been relying on was narrowing with each exchange. And he responded again, but the words came a fraction slower this time, as if he were measuring them more carefully than before. "You are simplifying a complex situation," he said, and the statement carried a defensive edge, not sharp, but present. And Naomi did not rush to answer. She allowed the words to settle, to be heard, to exist fully within the room. And then she took a breath, steady, controlled, and when she spoke, her voice softened slightly, not weaker, but more precise, drawing the room closer without raising the volume. "Clarity is not simplification," she said, and the distinction was immediate. It reframed the accusation into something else entirely, something constructive rather than reductive. And the judge leaned forward slightly again, his attention sharpened, his fingers resting still against the bench, no longer tapping, no longer moving, as if he understood that any interruption now would break something that needed to be fully seen. And Naomi continued, her gaze steady, her posture grounded. It is alignment, she added, and the word carried a quiet resonance, because alignment suggested coherence, consistency, a matching between what was said and what was true. And the clerk's pen moved steadily, capturing each word, each shift, each implication, and Ethan's shoulders tightened slightly, the tension now visible not just in his jaw, but in the way he held himself, as if the space around him had grown smaller, more defined, and he opened his mouth to respond, then paused again, the hesitation longer this time, more noticeable, and in that pause, the room seemed to lean in even further, not physically, but collectively, as if everyone present understood that something had reached a point where it could not be easily redirected. And Naomi did not fill the silence. She allowed it to expand, to settle, to do its work, because she understood that this was where the real shift happened, not in what was said, but in what could no longer be said the same way again. And as the seconds passed, the balance in the room continued to tilt, steady, irreversible, moving away from assumption and towards something far more difficult to deny, something that no longer belonged to one person's version of events, but to the shared understanding of everyone present. And for the first time since the exchange began, it was not clear who held the authority in the room, because authority had begun to separate from position and attach itself to something else entirely, something quieter, but far more enduring. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling into something heavier, something that no longer felt like a pause, but like a boundary that had been crossed without anyone noticing exactly when. And Ethan Cole stood within it, his posture still upright, still controlled, but the ease that once carried him through rooms like this had thinned into something more deliberate, more cautious. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, not weaker, but measured in a way that suggested he was no longer speaking from assumption. You are drawing conclusions from a limited view, he said, and the phrasing was careful, almost restrained, as if he understood now that every word would be examined beyond its surface. And a faint shift moved through the room, not agreement, not resistance, but attention, sharper now, more focused. And Naomi did not respond immediately. She allowed the words to settle, to be heard fully, and then she took a slow breath, her shoulders steady, her presence unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but there was a new layer beneath it now, something quieter, something deeper. I am working with what is visible, she said, and the distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, because visibility implied accountability. It implied that what could be seen could also be verified, could be questioned, could be recorded, and the judge's gaze shifted slightly, tracking the phrasing, while the clerk's pen continued moving without pause, capturing each turn with quiet precision. And Ethan's eyes flickered again, not away, but inward, as if he were recalculating not just his response, but his position. Within a moment that had grown more complex than he had anticipated, and he adjusted his stance, his shoes making a soft sound against the polished floor. But even that sound felt different now, less commanding, more contained. And Naomi continued, her voice steady, her tone consistent. If there is more to consider, she said, then it should have been considered before action was taken. And the sentence landed with quiet clarity, because it did not accuse, it outlined a sequence, a structure that could be followed. And the room responded with stillness again, deeper now, more focused, because the pattern was becoming unmistakable. And a man near the back shifted slightly, his posture tightening as if something had clicked into place, while the woman near the aisle who had been watching intently lowered her gaze for a moment, then lifted it again. Her expression changed, softer, but more certain, and Ethan's jaw tightened again, more visibly now, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. You are speaking as if there was time, he said, and the words carried a quiet push, an attempt to reintroduce urgency, to remind the room of the conditions under which decisions are made. And for a brief moment, it held, Because time was a factor, pressure was real, but Naomi did not challenge the existence of time. She acknowledged it with a slight nod, and that acknowledgement shifted the tone once more, because she was not dismissing the reality, she was refining it. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm precision. Time does not remove the need for awareness, she said, and the sentence settled into the room with a quiet weight. That did not require emphasis, because it stood on its own, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his attention fully engaged now, his fingers resting still against the bench, no longer tapping, no longer moving, as if he understood that this moment required stillness to be fully seen. And the clerk's pen moved steadily, the faint scratching sound consistent, uninterrupted, as if the record itself had found its rhythm. And Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused again, the hesitation longer this time, more visible, and in that pause, something shifted again, something subtle but undeniable, because it was no longer just about what he would say. It was about what he could say without contradicting what had already been established. And Naomi did not fill the silence. She allowed it to expand, to settle, to do its work, because she understood that the most powerful shifts did not come from force. They came from clarity, from allowing the truth to take shape without interruption. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, not weaker, but more focused, drawing the room closer without raising the volume. "You had enough time to assume," she said, "but not enough to confirm." And the phrasing was careful, balanced, but it carried a quiet force that reached beyond the words themselves, because it highlighted a choice, not just a condition, and the room responded with a deeper stillness, the kind that came when something fundamental had been revealed in a way that could not be easily dismissed. And Ethan's gaze held hers, but the tension in his expression had shifted, less rigid now, more complex, as if he were seeing the moment from a different angle, one that did not align with the position he had entered with. And the judge's eyes moved between them, tracking not just the exchange, but the transformation happening within it. And for the first time, the authority in the room felt less like a fixed point and more like something in motion, something being redefined in real time, not by volume, not by force, but by the quiet persistence of clarity. And as the seconds passed, no one moved, no one spoke, because everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that could not be undone once it had been fully seen. The stillness held longer this time, not fragile, not uncertain, but settled, like something had reached a point where it could no longer return to what it had been. And Ethan Cole remained where he stood, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless, the control he carried now requiring intention, requiring thought. And when he finally spoke, his voice came quieter, not diminished, but grounded in something different, something more deliberate. "You are suggesting that there was a choice," he said, and the words carried weight, because they acknowledged something he had not named before, and a faint shift moved through the room, not sound, not movement, but awareness, because everyone present understood the implication of that statement. And Naomi did not answer immediately. She allowed the words to settle, to expand, to take their place within the structure that had been forming between them. And then she nodded once, a small, measured acknowledgement, and when she spoke, her voice remained calm, steady, but there was a quiet depth beneath it now, something that reached beyond the surface of the exchange. "There is always a choice," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence gave it strength, because it did not rely on argument. It relied on truth that felt self-evident once spoken. And the judge's gaze shifted slightly, his expression tightening just enough to suggest he was weighing that statement against everything that had come before, while the clerk's pen continued moving, steady, uninterrupted, capturing each word with quiet precision. And Ethan's eyes held Naomi's, but there was a change there now, subtle but undeniable, not resistance, not defiance, but recognition, the kind that comes when something is seen clearly for the first time. And he exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled rhythm. In that moment, the priority was to maintain order, he said, and the phrasing was familiar, grounded in responsibility, in duty, in the framework that had shaped his decisions for years. And for a brief moment, it seemed to reintroduce structure, to bring the conversation back into a space that felt more defined. But Naomi did not challenge the priority. She acknowledged it with a slight nod, and that acknowledgement shifted the tone once more, because she was not opposing the principle, she was refining it, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same measured clarity. Order built on assumption is not stable, she said, and the sentence landed with quiet force, because it reframed the concept of order itself, separating appearance from substance, and the room responded with a deeper stillness, the kind that comes when something foundational has been questioned in a way that cannot be easily dismissed, and a man near the back leaned back slightly now, his expression thoughtful, as if he were reconsidering something he had taken for granted, while the woman near the aisle who had been watching closely lowered her hands into her lap, her posture more relaxed, but her attention sharper, more focused, and Ethan's jaw tightened. Again, but this time it was different, less rigid, more reflective, as if he were processing rather than resisting, and he spoke again, but the words came slower, more carefully. You are holding me to a standard that does not account for reality, he said, and the statement carried a quiet strain, not defensive, but searching, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment, and Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and when she responded, her voice softened slightly, not weaker, but more precise, drawing the room closer without raising the volume. I am holding you to a standard that defines reality, she said, and the distinction was immediate. It shifted the frame from limitation to foundation, from constraint to structure, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his attention fully engaged now, his fingers resting still against the bench, as if he understood that this was no longer just an exchange of words, it was a redefinition of terms, and the clerk's pen moved steadily, the faint scratching sound consistent, uninterrupted, as if the record itself had aligned with the direction of the moment, and Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, then paused again, the hesitation longer this time, more visible, and in that pause, something shifted again, something deeper, because it was no longer about finding the right words, it was about confronting what those words meant once spoken, and Naomi did not fill the silence, she allowed it to expand, to settle, to do its work, because she understood that clarity did not need to be forced, it needed space. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried that same quiet certainty, but now there was a layer of something else beneath it, something almost reflective. You acted as if certainty was already established, she said. But certainty requires confirmation, and the sentence landed with a quiet finality, not closing the conversation, but narrowing it, focusing it, and the room responded with a stillness that felt complete, not empty, but resolved in a way that made further denial difficult, and Ethan's gaze held hers, but the tension had shifted again. Less about control, more about awareness, and the judge's eyes moved between them, tracking not just the exchange, but the transformation within it. And for the first time since the moment began, the outcome felt less like something that would be decided and more like something that was already unfolding, step by step, in the quiet space between words, in the steady rhythm of truth being recognized. The room no longer felt like a place where decisions would be made. It felt like a place where something had already been revealed, and everyone was slowly catching up to it. And Ethan Cole stood at the center of that realization, his posture still composed, but the ease that once defined it replaced by something more deliberate, more internal, and when he spoke again, his voice did not carry the same outward authority, it carried reflection. Certainty is not always possible in the moment, he said, and the words did not push against Naomi's argument. They circled it, as if searching for space within it, and the subtle shift did not go unnoticed, not by the judge, whose gaze sharpened slightly, nor by the clerk, whose pen continued moving with steady consistency, capturing not just statements, but transitions, and Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but her presence now felt less like opposition and more like alignment with something larger than either of them. And when she responded, her voice remained calm, steady, but carried a deeper resonance. Then action must reflect that uncertainty, she said, and the sentence landed with quiet precision. Because it did not deny the limitation he described, it defined how that limitation should be handled, and a faint shift moved through the room. Not sound, not movement, but understanding, because the argument had moved beyond whether something could be known into how one should act when it could not. And Ethan's gaze lowered for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in thought, a subtle break in the line of eye contact that marked a turning point. And when he looked back up, there was something different there, something less rigid, more aware. "You are suggesting restraint," he said, and this time there was no resistance in the words, only recognition, and Naomi nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement that carried weight, because it confirmed not just the idea, but the direction the conversation had taken, and she answered, "I am suggesting awareness before assumption," and the distinction refined the concept further, narrowing it into something specific, something actionable, and the judge leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting still against the bench, no longer tapping, no longer shifting, as if he understood that this moment required full attention, and the courtroom remained silent, not out of instruction, but out of recognition that something important was being clarified, and Ethan exhaled. Slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a measured rhythm. And for the first time since the exchange began, he did not immediately respond. He allowed the silence to exist, to settle, to do what Naomi had been allowing it to do all along. And in that silence, something shifted again, something deeper, because it was no longer about defending a position, it was about understanding its limits. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quieter tone, not diminished, but grounded in something more reflective. "There are moments when hesitation creates risk," he said, and the statement did not challenge her. It expanded the conversation, introducing another layer, another dimension, and Naomi listened, her expression steady, her gaze unwavering, and when she responded, her voice softened slightly, not weaker, but more precise. "And there are moments when assumption creates greater risk," she said, and the balance between the two statements hung in the air, not in conflict, but in contrast, and the room responded with stillness again, deeper now, more focused, because the exchange had moved into a space where both perspectives existed, but one carried a clearer path forward, and the judge's eyes moved between them, tracking not just the words, but the alignment forming beneath them, and the clerk's pen continued its steady movement, the faint scratching sound now almost rhythmic, as if the record itself was keeping pace with the unfolding clarity, and Ethan's posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something within him had adjusted, and he spoke once more, but this time the words came slower, more deliberate. "I did not consider that," he said, and the admission was quiet, almost understated, but it carried a weight that filled the room more than any raised voice could have, because it marked the first true acknowledgement of a gap, not an information, but an approach, and Naomi did not react with triumph, did not press forward. She simply held the moment, allowing it to exist without interruption, because she understood that this was where change began, not in argument, but in recognition, and the judge leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into something more defined, something closer to resolution, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the significance of what had just been said settled into the room with quiet finality, and as the seconds passed, the balance that had been shifting throughout the exchange reached a point where it no longer felt unstable. It felt aligned, not by force, not by authority, but by the steady presence of clarity that had been built piece by piece, word by word, until it could no longer be ignored. The admission did not echo, but it settled into the room with a quiet weight that changed everything that came after it. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the clerk whose pen hovered mid-line, not the man in the back who had been leaning forward for the past several minutes, not even the judge, whose hands rested still against the bench as if he understood that the next moment required space. And Naomi Reed did not speak immediately. She allowed the words to exist fully, to be recognized for what they were, not a defense, not a justification, but a realization. And when she finally drew a breath, it was slow, measured, not to prepare for another argument, but to acknowledge the shift that had already taken place, and her voice, when it came, was softer now, not weaker, but grounded in something deeper than before. "That matters," she said, and the simplicity of the sentence carried more weight than anything she had said earlier, because it did not push forward, it held the moment in place, and Ethan Cole's gaze remained on her, But there was a change there now, something less guarded, less rigid, as if the need to maintain a position had given way to something more difficult, more honest, and he nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that the moment had reached a point he could not ignore, and the judge shifted in his seat, his posture straightening just enough to signal that he was about to re-enter the exchange, but he did not speak yet. He waited, watching, as if he understood that what was unfolding between them had its own rhythm, its own structure, and interrupting it too soon would disrupt something that needed to complete itself. And Naomi's gaze did not waver, but it softened, not in sympathy, not in concession, but in recognition, as if she understood that the distance between them had changed, not physically, but in meaning. And when she spoke again, her words were slower, more deliberate. "What happens next is not about correcting the past," she said. "It is about how you move forward from it." And the sentence did not accuse, it did not demand, it defined a path, and the room responded with a stillness that felt different from before, less tense, more focused, as if the energy that had been building throughout the exchange had settled into something clearer, something more constructive. And Ethan's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension that had been held there for so long easing just enough to be noticeable. And he took a breath, deeper this time, as if he were allowing himself to process not just the moment, but everything that had led to it. And when he spoke, his voice carried that shift, quieter, more reflective. "I should have taken a second longer," he said, and the statement was simple, but it carried a clarity that had not been present before, because it did not rely on explanation, it relied on acknowledgement. And the clerk's pen resumed moving, capturing the words with steady precision, while the judge's gaze remained fixed, his expression now more defined, more resolved, as if he were seeing the outline of what needed to be said next. And Naomi nodded once, a small, measured acknowledgement, and she did not add anything to it. She did not expand on his statement or challenge it. She allowed it to stand on its own, because she understood that recognition, once reached, did not need to be forced further, it needed to be held. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was complete, filled with the quiet understanding that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And the judge finally leaned forward, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that settled across the room. "The court will take a brief recess," he said, and the words were procedural, expected, but they carried a different tone now, not interruption, but acknowledgement that the moment required space beyond the walls of immediate response. And the gavel lowered, not sharply, but with a controlled finality that marked the end of something that had begun long before the sound itself. And as the room began to move, slowly, quietly, chairs shifting, papers being gathered, the low murmur of voices returning, Naomi remained where she stood for a moment longer, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as if she were allowing the space to settle fully before stepping out of it. And Ethan did not move immediately either, his gaze still fixed forward, not on her, not on the judge, but somewhere in between, as if he were seeing something differently now, something that had been there all along but had only just come into focus. And when he finally turned, it was not abrupt, not reactive, it was deliberate, measured, and for a brief moment, their eyes met again, not in conflict, not in opposition, but in a quiet understanding that did not need to be spoken. And then Naomi turned toward the aisle, her steps steady, unhurried, the sound of her shoes soft against the polished floor. And as she moved through the room, people shifted slightly to make space, not because they were told to, but because something about her presence now required it, something that had nothing to do with position and everything to do with what had just been revealed. And she did not look back. She did not need to, because the moment had already done what it needed to do, and the room, though it returned to motion, would not return to what it had been before. The courtroom did not return to noise all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a room remembering how to breathe after holding it too long. And Naomi Reed stepped into the hallway, where the light felt different, warmer, filtered through tall windows that stretched nearly 12 feet high, casting long reflections across the polished floor. And the scent of old paper and wood followed her out, faint but familiar, grounding. While behind her the muted sounds of movement continued, doors opening and closing, low voices blending into a distant hum. and she paused near the end of the corridor, not because she was unsure of where to go, but because the moment still lingered in her chest, steady, present, and she placed her hand lightly against the cool surface of the wall, feeling the texture beneath her fingertips, solid, real, as if confirming that everything that had just happened existed beyond memory, and her breathing remained even, controlled, not hurried, not heavy, just consistent. The same rhythm she had carried through the entire exchange, and for a few seconds she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to settle, to let the weight of the moment distribute itself evenly, not as pressure, but as understanding, and footsteps approached from behind, measured, not rushed, and she did not turn immediately. She recognized the sound before she saw him, the slight pause between steps, the shift in pace that signaled hesitation, and when Ethan Cole stopped a few feet away, the space between them felt different from before, no longer defined by tension, but by something quieter, more deliberate. And he spoke first, his voice lower now, not because of the setting, but because something within him had adjusted. "I did not expect that," he said, and the statement was simple, without defense, without framing, just an acknowledgement of a reality that had shifted, and Naomi opened her eyes, turning slightly to face him, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, and she studied him for a moment, not critically, not cautiously, but with a quiet attention that allowed space for what he had said to exist without being challenged, and she responded just as simply, "Most people do not." And the exchange did not carry the same edge it had inside the courtroom. It moved differently here, slower, more reflective, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze lowering briefly before returning to hers, and for the first time, there was no attempt to control the moment, no attempt to direct it, only a presence within it, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing in a way that suggested he was no longer holding himself against something, but allowing himself to move through it. "I should have listened," he said, and the words were not an extension of what he had said earlier. They were deeper, more personal, and Naomi did not respond immediately. She let the sentence settle, let it find its place between them, and then she nodded slightly, acknowledging it without amplifying it, because she understood that recognition did not need reinforcement, it needed space, and the hallway remained quiet around them. The distant sounds of the courtroom now softened into background, and a faint breeze moved through the corridor from an open window at the far end, carrying with it the subtle scent of the outside, something cleaner, lighter, and Ethan glanced toward that window for a brief second before looking back, as if noticing it for the first time, as if his awareness had expanded beyond the narrow focus he had carried earlier, and when he spoke again, his voice held that same quiet tone. "What you said in there," he paused, not searching for words, but choosing them carefully. It changed something. And Naomi's expression remained steady, but there was a slight shift. In her eyes, a recognition of the truth in his statement, not as something new, but as something she had already understood, and she replied softly. It was already there, and the distinction mattered, because it shifted the source of change from her words to his awareness, from action to realization, and Ethan absorbed that, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer before lowering slightly again, not out of discomfort, but out of reflection, and he nodded once more, slower this time, as if the movement carried more meaning, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer heavy, no longer tense, but settled, complete in a way that did not require filling, and then Naomi stepped away from the wall, her movement smooth, unhurried, and she turned toward the exit at the end of the hallway, her steps steady, consistent, and Ethan remained where he stood, watching her for a moment, not as an authority, not as an opponent, but as someone who had just witnessed something that could not be unseen. And as she moved further down the corridor, the light from the window ahead grew brighter, reflecting off the floor in long, clean lines, and when she reached the door, she paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle, and without turning back, she spoke, her voice quiet, but clear enough to carry. "What matters is what you do next." And then she stepped through, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the hallway still once more, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, the words settling into him the same way everything else had, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as a direction. And when he finally turned back toward the courtroom, his steps were slower, more deliberate, not because he had lost something, but because he had gained something he had not known he was missing. And as he walked, the sound of his footsteps echoed faintly against the walls, steady, measured, different from before, not louder, not softer, but aligned in a way that felt new, even to him. The hallway quiet did not follow Naomi outside. It stayed behind her, contained within walls that had witnessed something shift in a way they were not built to hold. And as she stepped into the open air, the late afternoon light spread across the courthouse steps in long, warm lines, the kind that softened edges and made everything feel slower, more grounded, and she paused at the top for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, taking in the space, the distant hum of traffic, the faint echo of voices from people passing by who had no idea what had just unfolded inside. And her shoulders remained relaxed, her breathing steady, as if the weight she carried was not something to escape from, but something she had already learned how to hold. And behind her, through the heavy courthouse doors, movement resumed, voices rising and falling, the rhythm of procedure returning, but it no longer carried the same meaning. Not for everyone. And inside, Ethan Cole stepped back. Into the courtroom, the air cooler, the lighting sharper, and the familiar setting did not feel the same. The angles of the room unchanged, but the way he saw them altered, as if a layer had been removed that he had never realized was there. And people glanced at him as he entered, not openly, not directly, but enough that he felt it, the shift in perception that did not need words to exist. And he moved toward his position with measured steps, not slower, not faster, just more deliberate, each one placed with an awareness that had not been there before. And when he stood again near the center, his posture remained upright, but the rigidity had softened into something more balanced, more intentional, and the judge returned shortly after, taking his seat with a composed expression that carried a quiet finality, the kind that suggested the room would not simply return to what it had been. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, but there was a difference beneath it, a clarity that aligned with what had already unfolded. The court has reviewed the events that occurred prior to recess, he said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that did not require emphasis, and the clerk's pen moved steadily, capturing each word with quiet precision. While the public defender sat straighter now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by focus. And Ethan remained still, his gaze forward, but his attention fully present, not scanning the room, not asserting control, but absorbing, and the judge continued. The record will reflect that assumptions were made before confirmation was established, and the phrasing echoed what had already been said, but now it carried institutional weight, transforming observation into a